Please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David Keene.
Right here, David. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush, for those of you who don't know me, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Reagan Presidential Foundation. I just want to thank all of you for coming here this evening in honor of our men and women in uniform who protect us and defend our freedoms around the world. If you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. It is a real pleasure to welcome David Keene to the Reagan Library this evening. I also want to point out that David has with him Tom Mason. Tom is the Executive Secretary of the National Rifle Association, and I know they'll be co-signing their recent book in our store just following David's remarks. So Tom, welcome to you as well. You know, I have no doubt that many in the audience already well know of David's deep background in countless important conservative causes over the past 4 decades. It is amazing, David, as you were just saying, how time flies. I've been involved in some of those same battles since the days of the Reagan administration. So I can attest to one thing, and that is if the name David Keene comes up in one particular struggle or another to preserve conservatism as a way of life in this country, you'd better sit up and listen. It means that the fight ahead or the legislation that needs to be passed or defeated or the campaign to be prosecuted is of critical importance to the conservative movement. Like a few others who've spoken here before, David is one of a handful of important activists who were with President Reagan long before there was a President Reagan. He served as the president's Southern Regional Coordinator for the Reagan 1976 bid for the presidential nomination, and from there he went on to serve as a campaign advisor to President Bush 41, as well as to Senator Bob Dole when he ran in 1988 and 1996. In between those campaigns, and since then, David has been a leading figure in the American conservative movement, whether it be in his role as president of the NRA, editor-at-large at the Washington Times, chairman of the American Conservative Union, organizer of the wildly successful CPAC conference, or chairman of YAF, the Young Americans for Freedom. He comes to us today in his role as an important author engaged in an important cause. The subtitle of his most recent book says it all: The New Assaults on Your Second Amendment. I've no doubt that it'll be one of the topics that David might touch on in his book, Shall Not Be Infringed, that we'll hear about more from him today. But he is a wealth of knowledge on so many issues in the conservative fight to keep America conservative. And it is an honor, really, ladies and gentlemen, for me to ask you to join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library Mr. David Keene.
John, thank you. Actually, I'm the one who's honored to be able to stand here in the Reagan Library and talk to you. I've been asked to talk about the question of conservatives and our current president, Donald Trump. So it might be worth a minute or two to reflect on the difficulty of assessing the success or failure or the grading of a president over time. History tends to reassess presidents over time, and a president who's lightly regarded in one decade may be highly regarded in the next. Ronald Reagan is as good an example of this as anyone. Those of us who knew him, those of us who worked with him, those of us who followed his presidency know and realize, as is widely accepted today, that Ronald Reagan was not just one of the greatest presidents of our lifetime, but one of the greatest presidents this country has ever had lead it. But that was not always the general assessment. You remember when Ronald Reagan was running for president, he was dismissed by the establishment of the day as an extremist, a dangerous man who would blow up the world. A leading Democratic figure said once he was elected that he was an amiable dunce, and he wasn't going to be very successful as president. Interestingly, and I want to start with, because this does tell the whole story in a sense, some years ago, Robbie George, a professor at Princeton University, sponsored a 3-day session on the past, present, and future of American conservatism. And in the course of that program, there was a panel on the Reagan presidency. And one of the panelists was Lou Cannon, who's perhaps the most knowledgeable journalist in terms of Ronald Reagan. He'd covered him here in California as governor. He'd written books about him, and he covered him as president. And in the course of his remarks, or at the conclusion of his remarks, Lou said that in his opinion, Ronald Reagan was probably the greatest president of his lifetime. As the remarks ended, immediately M. Stanton Evans, a leading writer of the conservative movement, stood up and he said, "Lou, I listened very carefully to what you said, but I also read your book." He had written a book called Reagan, Role of a Lifetime, which was a very critical biography just after the president left office. He said, "I read your book, I listened to your speech, and my question is a simple one. How could the man who gave this speech write that book?" And Lou looked at him and he said, "I could write that speech and now write that book and now give this speech for the very simple reason that I'm still alive." And he said, "I wake up every morning realizing that Ronald Reagan was a greater president than I thought he was the night before when I went to sleep." And that was a pretty good answer. But that's how difficult it is sometimes to assess political figures, political leaders, because it's bound up in ideology, it's bound up in the politics of the moment, it's bound up in partisanship in the media. So I think we should bear that in mind as we look at the Trump presidency at this early time. Conservative hand-wringing over candidate and now President Donald J. Trump began early and continues today. Some conservatives who announced themselves early as never Trumpsters, you remember them, predicted first that he couldn't win the Republican presidential nomination, that if he did win it, he would lose the White House to Hillary Clinton and cost the Republican Party at every level. There were a lot of reasons for this. There were many people who were upset with his manner, were upset with where he came from, upset with his background, upset with whether they could really count on him to govern if elected as a conservative, and who had these doubts about him. If you go through this museum, in this library, and if you were familiar with the Reagan presidency or worked for him as I did and as many people here did, you're tempted to sort of paraphrase Lloyd Benson of some years ago when he talked to Dan Quayle about John Kennedy and say, "I knew Ronald Reagan was a friend of mine, and Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan." But then neither is anyone else a Ronald Reagan. Leaders of that quality, leaders like Ronald Reagan or Franklin Roosevelt, come along once in a generation or once in a lifetime. And it's, I think, unfair to those, to others to measure them by that yardstick. We should look for leadership that approaches perfection, communicators that are as good as Reagan, but they aren't always there. And so we have to deal with real people in a real world. On Election Day, 2016, Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol posted online that he was very proud of his role in creating the Never Trump movement, looked forward to the man's defeat that day, he did this on election morning, and was ready to join others like him in rebuilding the Republican Party as soon as Trump was defeated and gone. Some, like Kristol, were appalled at candidate Trump's apostasy on foreign policy questions. They'd worked hard since the Reagan years to redefine the late president's belief in peace through strength into something quite different and far more aggressive. The intellectual struggle over just how the Republican Party and, more importantly, the conservative movement should address foreign policy and defense issues in the post-Soviet era has been debated quietly and mostly behind the scenes since President George W. Bush, after 9/11, joined what has become known as the neoconservative camp and became an advocate of using American power to democratize the world and recreate nations in the American image. Others within the party, most notably perhaps Rand Paul of Kentucky, favor a far less aggressive foreign policy that critics have described inaccurately, I think, as isolationist, while still others adopt what might best be described as a quasi-realist approach to foreign policy questions that, in my opinion at least, comes closer to the stance this country took during the Reagan years. As president, Ronald Reagan used armed force less than most modern presidents, but made it clear that he would if he had to. The underlying definition of peace through strength might best be summed up by the answer General Colin Powell gave to President Bill Clinton's newly minted Secretary of State shortly after Mr. Clinton became president in 1992. President Clinton and Madeleine Albright, his Secretary of State, were agitating for a commitment of American ground troops in the Balkans. And when General Powell objected, Secretary Albright supposedly asked him why we spend so much time on maintaining such an army if we aren't going to use it. General Powell reportedly responded, "Madam Secretary, we maintain a big army precisely so we won't have to use it." That was part of the message of the Reagan years and part of the strategy that was so successful under President Reagan. President Trump, to his credit, seemed during his campaign to want to move closer to a Reaganite policy than that of either the pure neoconservatives or the new isolationists. But as long as the debate within the Republican Party on foreign policy continues, his every move in the foreign sphere will be open to criticism. Others were equally appalled by the candidate's past views on both social and economic issues. Free and expanded trade, what some today call globalism, has been an article of conservative and Republican faith for decades. One is reminded of the differences then President Reagan had with some of his staunchest and most loyal supporters on just such issues, and while no president is 100% consistent, free trade was a hallmark of Reagan's policies. The possibility that a Trump administration would reject free trade in favor of protectionist policies that square neither with conservative free market views nor have much historic chance of working turned off many traditional free market conservatives and still causes severe heartburn. And then there's the man's style. His constant tweets and off-the-cuff remarks worried supporters and critics alike during the campaign and worry his advisors today. Let's face it, this president seems to enjoy popping off in a sort of stream of consciousness way that troubles, annoys, and sometimes horrifies those around him while providing his critics with what seem a constant supply of ammunition to be thrown back in his face. Those who oppose Mr. Trump because he couldn't win have, of course, been proven wrong. It may be true that he might not have won, but for the fact that he ran against one of the most flawed Democratic candidates ever nominated, but he won. He is President of the United States, but they still oppose him, arguing that he is destroying the Republican Party, will cost Republicans the Congress next year and the White House in 1020, and pointing to his currently rather dismal poll numbers. But poll numbers go up and down. and are often a poor predictor of future electoral performance. Consider President Reagan's numbers for a minute. At this stage in his first term, President Reagan enjoyed an approval rating of 59%, but those numbers headed south fairly quickly. And by the next year, he was at 40%, on his way to 35% in January of 1983. The talking heads of the day were predicting disaster in 1984, and Republicans on the Hill were beginning to go wobbly, as his friend Margaret Thatcher might have put it. But Mr. Reagan was reelected in 1984 in a landslide and left office 4 years later with an approval rating above 63%. Others have overcome worse numbers. Harry Truman, I have to turn the page to get the actual number. Harry Truman's approval rating dropped to 22% in early 1952. And when he won re-election over Tom Dewey that fall, his approval-disapproval number stood at 30-56, enough to convince any pollster, let alone the Chicago Tribune, that he just couldn't win. Ronald Reagan, like Bill Buckley, believed that anyone who agreed with him most of the time was a friend and not an enemy. And when one looks at what Donald Trump has done since moving into the Oval Office, one has to conclude that, rhetoric aside, he's been doing a fairly credible job. The polls began to collapse for Mrs. Clinton after the final debate, in which she had finally let the public see her view of what a Clinton majority on the Supreme Court might mean for individual rights, for free speech, the Second Amendment, and freedom of religion in this country. Mr. Trump had already promised to fill the Scalia seat on the Supreme Court with someone who would follow in Justice Scalia's footsteps, and once elected, he did that and more. I was president of the National Rifle Association, and we endorsed Donald Trump's candidacy because of the consequences that we felt we would face if, in fact, Mrs. Clinton got the right to appoint the next Supreme Court justice. As soon as candidate Trump made that promise, the NRA and many other groups and many other individuals around the country said, now we know what we have to do. And that issue became perhaps more important than it had been in previous elections. He not only delivered on that promise, but his appointments to the lower federal courts have been first-rate thus far. His cabinet choices have also been, from a conservative perspective, pretty darn good. Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, Tom Price at Health and Human Services, Scott Pruitt at EPA, Betsy DeVos at Education, Mike Mulvaney at the OMB, Elaine Chao along with Rick Perry at Energy and at Labor and Energy, Transportation and Energy, and General James Madison at Defense, and even Ben Carson at Housing and Urban Development. They make up a more conservative cabinet than any president has appointed since Ronald Reagan left Washington. In a much more conservative cabinet than anyone would have predicted this president would have appointed, and that includes his staunchest supporters. The Los Angeles Times, which I, by the way, don't read usually, but I looked it up because I was coming out here, upon reviewing his picks in December of last year, concluded that the new president had put together, and I'm quoting, one of the most consistently conservative domestic policy teams in modern history. Trump's critics have complained about divisions within his White House staff and his failure to change the world, or as he might put it, to drain the swamp within the first few months in office. But as he and his team have quickly discovered, swamps may be harder to drain than they thought. Whether Mr. Trump will recover or whether he'll continue to govern as a conservative remains in doubt. His recent willingness to work with Democrats in the Senate, born of frustration, is seen by some as a capitulation to the left. And it was certainly less than adroitly handled as far as his allies in the Senate and House are concerned. But it could be instead a sign that he recognizes, as previous presidents have, that you don't get everything you want on your own terms every day, and that you have to work with whoever you have to work with to accomplish your goals. The really troubling thing about what's gone on since last November has not been the president's sometimes awkward or even naive tweets, statements, or his policies, but the reaction of those unwilling to accept the results of an American election. The never-Trumpsters within the Republican Party, the media, and the leadership of the Democratic Party are not just in denial, but define themselves today simply in terms of their opposition to a sitting president, and glory in labeling themselves as part of the resistance. For those who backed other candidates of either party to spend their time maligning the President of the United States as a Nazi and hoping for his removal from office by assassination, impeachment, or indictment for colluding with the nation's enemies is both unconscionable and incredibly dangerous in terms of the system that has allowed us to create the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Conservatives, above all, should know better. They should not make the mistake of backing his every action or declaring themselves willing to follow him wherever he might take them, but neither should they reject his presidency as illegitimate. They should give Donald Trump credit where he has advanced the ball on policies they favor and oppose policies with which they disagree. Mr. Trump is president today not because Vladimir Putin wanted him in the White House, or even because his Democratic opponent was a terrible candidate, but because he tapped into the concerns of millions of Americans who've been left behind, ignored, and finally dismissed by a governing elite that has become increasingly isolated in what he would no doubt term the Washington swamp. In many ways, I think that I'm the sort of person who voted for Donald Trump in the fall. I'm the first member of my family ever to graduate from college. My father was a union organizer. We were a Democratic family. My mother was the 5-term president of the Women's Auxiliary of the United Auto Workers. I have a brother who's a cop, a brother who's an auto worker. I come from Wisconsin. And when I went home to Wisconsin, these are people in the Midwest that are suffering. Many of them shifted to the Republican Party under Nixon and under President Reagan in frustrated annoyance at the social objections they had to the Democratic Party. They became Republicans and voted Republicans, and more of them moved this year because now there's not only the problem of democratic and liberal social policies that have left them behind, but the bragging of elites that they don't count, that they don't matter. I went back to my native state in the early fall, and I should have had a clue then. I should have known exactly how the election was going to turn out, as my wife told me. I met with many of the people that I graduated from high school with 50 years ago. Many of them were unemployed. Most of them didn't go to college. A lot of them didn't have jobs, and a lot of them were angry. And then I drove down the streets of a small town, and on each side of the street and every front lawn was a sign that said, "Proudly deplorable." And that actually said it all. You know, I don't mean this pejoratively about the Democrats, but it was said years ago of the communists that they may have loved the working class, but they hated workers. Mrs. Clinton and the Democratic elite talk a lot about working people in the middle class, but they don't really want to associate with them or be involved with them. Donald Trump tapped into that in a way that no other candidate has. If it hadn't been Donald Trump this cycle, it might have been another presidential candidate in another cycle because the pressure, the frustration, the alienation in the heartland of this country was building. And his election sends a signal to both parties that you can't ignore, you can't dismiss, you can't condemn, you can't demonize major sections of the electorate and get away with it for long. It provides a great opportunity for Republicans and conservatives to appeal to voters that had in earlier years dismissed their overtures toward them. Because conservatives like the progressives who dominate today's Democratic Party have been themselves guilty of failing to appreciate the negative consequences of some of the policies that we support, both as a matter of faith and based on our empirical understanding of what works and doesn't work. Charles Murray, for example, is as ideological a free trader as anyone is ever likely to find anywhere. Murray argues that while the economic macro benefits of free trade cannot be disputed, that in implementing our policies, we forgot about the micro consequences of those policies on some people in the country. He said that it was like academics implementing a policy paper, not like politicians, not like leaders, not like people that care and understand people. Republicans and conservatives learn, or should learn, part of our belief and our faith is that we do learn and that we deal with real world problems, not simply as ideologues, but as people who understand tradition, understand change, and understand the need to apply eternal values to immediate problems. The Trump administration may do that. Certainly, we need to do that. Donald Trump entered the White House with no real political experience, no understanding of how Washington works, or much appreciation of the need to both lead and work with friends and allies in Congress. His education and on-the-job training has at times been awkward, but it continues. Some presidents never learn. Jimmy Carter comes to mind. But others have survived the hazing that comes with the job and go on to become pretty good chief executives. We can hope that Mr. Trump will be one of those. American voters going to the polls in presidential years are faced with what amounts to a binary choice between two parties and their candidates. Oh, there are always a smattering of others on the ballot, but they rarely impact the outcome of the election. Donald Trump was not my first choice last year, but when it became clear that he would be the party's nominee and that the alternative was Hillary Clinton, I was and remain convinced that the country, the values I hold dear, and the policies I support would all benefit if he, rather than Mrs. Clinton, sat in the White House. That was our choice last November, and while it's impossible in today's world to predict whether Mr. Trump will manage to accomplish what we hope he will accomplish, I'm glad we're giving him a chance. An influential Washingtonian friend of mine with ties to both parties told me a few years ago during the final years of George W. Bush's administration that many of his friends kept confronting him with George W. Bush's missteps and policies that they didn't like. And he said, I always told them, you know, I agree almost completely with you. He said, but every time I get angry, I think back and I realize that George W. Bush did two things for this country. The first was he denied the White House to Al Gore. And the second was that he denied the White House to John Kerry. And he said, do you know how many mistakes he'd have to make before I would not think that he did more for us than he could possibly have messed up? Donald Trump saved this country from Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump saved the Supreme Court from Hillary Clinton's nominees. We should be concerned about what he or any president does in the future, because what they did yesterday and the day before isn't the whole story. But we should support presidents when they're doing the right thing and be critical on the merits of policies that we don't agree with, rather than joining an attack on the people who make those policies. That's what presidential politics should be all about. As we came in here, we did the tour of the museum, and like most of you, I loved Ronald Reagan's presidency. And the one thing that Ronald Reagan represented in many ways was the hope of America. And the message that he delivered was always hopeful, was always positive. And we have a great future ahead of us, but we have to be able to work with people to get there. Maybe that's what Donald Trump is learning now. He's undergoing the education that any president has to be, and I've got to believe he's smarter than Jimmy Carter. So I've got to believe that he's going to come out of this educational training with the capability of providing us with the kind of leadership and the kind of training that we can admire. So I could talk forever. My wife sometimes says that I do that. But I would prefer instead to use our remaining time to answer any questions you might have. You notice I was focusing on conservatives in the Trump administration rather than on the Second Amendment. But I did point out, and I do point out, that one of the reasons that so many Americans supported Donald Trump in 2016 was because of our fear that a Supreme Court out of control would not just diminish but could extinguish many vital American rights, including the rights we enjoy under the Second Amendment. My wife has one other thing that she tells me: don't go anywhere without selling your books. So Tom and I are going to be out there after this is over selling our books, and if you want to make my wife happy, you would buy one of those books from us. So thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, super. We've got a few minutes for questions for David, if you would. Thank you. Raise your hand as you are. We have staff with microphones. Just if you'd wait till we put a microphone in your hand so we can hear what your question is. So let's, right over here, sir. Yeah.
Mr. Keene, thank you so much for your work with the NRA and the Second Amendment. And I've been a member of the NRA for a long time. Guns, need them, got them, don't really like them. And my question is, what is it with the marketing, the promotion, the advertising of the NRA which keeps trying to promote gun rights as opposed to God-given fundamental self-defense rights, which the guns are just a necessary tool for, but we're not hitting the hearts and minds, especially here in California, thank you for coming here, that I don't promote the NRA as a second rights or gun rights group. Mm-hmm. I promote it as a civil rights group, perhaps the #1 civil rights group in America. Can the NRA push harder in this direction, more with the heart and the emotion?
Well, that's what the Second Amendment is about. The title of our book, Shall Not Be Infringed, those are the important words of the Second Amendment. The right to defend oneself was not something that was granted by the founders. The wording of the Second Amendment makes clear that the founders recognized that as a pre-existing right that shall not be infringed by the government. In the modern world, that often involves firearms. We don't limit ourselves to firearms. We have particularly in the cities a women's defense course that's taught called Refuse to be a Victim that has nothing to do with guns. But you're right. The reason the Second Amendment exists is to recognize the right of people to defend themselves, their families, their communities, and their nation. And that pre-existed the American Constitution.
But the only reason I ask that is the way it's promoted, we need to get people on our side. And I think it turns off. If as a gun person, I'm not particularly excited by defending your gun rights, but hey, this saves the lives of senior citizens. This saves the lives of minorities. This is an essential thing that when the left comes to destroy the Second Amendment, what we have to hit back with.
Well, that's our greatest growth is in self-defense. The greatest growth in the NRA in recent years has been women who generally come in because they want firearms to defend themselves. They know that gives them an opportunity. That's where we get that. But you have to focus. A group like the NRA is a family that's involved in many things. We have self-defense people, we have hunters, we have shooters. Nowadays in our progressive schools, you don't learn all of history. You learn that something took place at the Concord Bridge a long time ago that resulted in the war, the Revolutionary War. But the students aren't really taught anymore why the British were there. They were there to confiscate the ammunition so that the colonists wouldn't be able to defend themselves. They couldn't confiscate the guns because those were in private hands. But there were central depositories of ammunition so they could get more, and the British figured if we can disarm them, then we won't have trouble. This is a nation that has always understood those rights, and it goes to self-defense, it goes to all of the shooting sports, and the NRA has been there to defend all of those things, and it is, as you say, the largest civil rights organization and the oldest in the country.
It's over here.
Good evening. Thank you for your remarks. I'll follow up on a Second Amendment question. Last term, the U.S. Supreme Court once again avoided a Second Amendment case, and they have done so now for decades. Do you see the Supreme Court taking up a case in the near future to delineate the rights that they've put forth in Heller McDonald? The last case was the case out of California dealing with concealed weapon permits, and actually it was the first time there were two dissents. Justice Thomas dissented and was joined by Justice Gorsuch in the court's failure to take that case.
When I talk about the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court and the courts, and this is why the courts are so important, Second Amendment law today is where First Amendment law was in 1920. In 1920, we knew that there was a right to free speech, but it took 100 court cases to lay out the parameters of what you could and could not do in terms of restricting speech, taxing speech, licensing speech, where could you speak and where you couldn't. Today, we pretty much know what you can and can't do. On the Second Amendment, those cases haven't been decided. What we now have is a declaration of the right. But like every fundamental right, as was pointed out by the Supreme Court, like the right to free speech or like the others, fundamental rights are subject to what are called reasonable restrictions. The question of what is and isn't reasonable will have to be determined by these court cases. Frankly, right now, as a practical matter, I wouldn't want some of those cases in the United States Supreme Court because the majority that existed on the general question probably does not exist on the specific restrictive questions that will come before the court. If Donald Trump as president delivers on his promise to make the next appointment to the court from a list similar to that he used to pick Neil Gorsuch for the court, then the court will change. What the Gorsuch nomination did was save the majority, the narrow majority that existed prior to Justice Scalia's death. If that had gone to progressive justice, the court would have been lost. But to really get those cases before the court, you need a friendlier court. So there are a lot of people who are very nervous about those kinds of cases going up too soon.
We have another question right back here.
Hello, my name's Alexander. My biggest problem was with the debt. The last time the debt was cut was in 1957 by President Eisenhower. The last time a president entered office with more debt than when he left was under President Coolidge. My biggest concern is with Social Security and Medicare, which are the two largest items in the federal budget. And no president has made attempts to shrink Social Security and Medicare or phase it out. Now, I'm not saying that it should be eliminated altogether immediately. I'm saying that it should be eventually phased out in order to cut the debt.
Well, it doesn't need to be phased out. It obviously needs reform of one sort or another. And to be fair, in his second term, George W. Bush wanted to take on the reform of entitlements. The problem with pioneers is that they often end up with arrows in their back and don't get what it was that they wanted. But the discussion of reforming these programs in a way that will avoid the bankruptcy crash that's going to happen to this country at some point is on the table finally. It's difficult to get those things done. It's a lot easier to spend money than to cut spending. We have a government that frankly is at the congressional level is sort of designed to increase spending, but all of the cuts in domestic programs, all of the military cuts, none of those things have the kind of impact that will ultimately put this country on a sound basis unless we're able to deal with runaway entitlement spending and redirect these programs in a way that both provide the security that our citizens need on the one hand, but without breaking the bank on the other. There are a lot of people who think that can be done, but the political courage to do it is something that's hard to find.
Right over here.
When you consider conservatism in California,
Actually, I don't think of them the same.
this is the problem. So,
Oh,
I
these
was
are separate
wondering,
things.
Since you don't live here, do you see any signs at all of any kind of movement of growth in conservatism in California? Is there anything there?
I try to stay away from California as much as I can, except when I come out to visit institutions like this. You know, there are a lot of conservatives in California. We have a lot of, at the NRA, for example, we have a lot of members in California. And they often, when I was president of the NRA, they'd come to me and say, you know, we ought to have a referendum out there, and if you could just raise $30 million or so, we might be able to win. And I said, well, then other states will also demand 10 million, 20 million, 30 million. One of the questioners alluded to the fact that what we do in California is we aid going to the courts to try and get fundamental rights protected. And we do that in states where we can't, as a practical matter, win political majorities. But you know, you think of people tend to think of the world as stagnant, politically and economically. In other words, it's not. If 1968 was the lowest point for gun rights in this country in modern times. The Johnson administration passed the Gun Control Act of 1968. A year and a half later, Elliot Richardson convened a commission that recommended, with his endorsement, that all sidearms be confiscated and that none be sold or manufactured or be allowed to be imported into the United States within 10 years. If you had asked somebody in 1968 about the country, if you had asked them, do you think that by 2017 all 50 states would have a concealed carry law on the books? They'd laugh at you. The NRA got into politics because a Democratic congressman from Michigan, John Dingell, liberal Democrat for that matter, came to us in the early 70s and said, look, you can do what you've been doing for 100 years. You can train people in gun safety, you can run competitions, you can do all of these things. It's not going to matter because you're not going to have any guns unless you step up politically. And up to that point, the NRA didn't have a political arm. We didn't have a lobbying arm. We didn't endorse candidates. We didn't do all those things. And people said, this isn't going to work because look at the attitudes. Look at the politicians. Look at where we are. It's never going to change. Things do change. Things change when enough people who care get out and do the work necessary to affect those changes. That can happen in California. It's happened elsewhere. California is, I liken some of the politicians in California and Illinois to the, you know, after World War II, they'd find these Japanese soldiers that didn't get the word on these islands. They're sort of like that. But at some point, things are moving nationally. They're moving in most states in a direction that I like, and they'll move here too. It'll just take time. It'll take a lot of work. It'll take money, but it'll take dedication. And I don't ever accept that the world tomorrow is going to be exactly like it is today, because it isn't going to be. The world tomorrow is going to be the world that we shape. And if we do the work we need to do on this and other issues, we have a chance of passing on to our children and grandchildren the kind of world we want to pass on to them.
I think there was another question here, yeah, and then we'll go.
Even California.
Mr. Keene, thanks for being here with us tonight and promoting the conservative values and truths and your service to the NRA. I'm a benefactor with the NRA as well as a trainer. My question is related to national reciprocity for concealed carry. I know there's discussions and talk of that within the administration. Do you or anybody in your circle of influence have any relation to speaking into the administration's perspective of that? And then how can that come to California when we have such a leftist state government, as well as hiring somebody like Eric Holder to push back on the national level?
Well, Eric is Eric. For those of you who are not gun people or NRA people, the question involves reciprocity for concealed carry permits. If you have a concealed carry permit today and you want to drive across the country, you best have a lawyer in the passenger seat, because the laws and the jurisdictions are so different that you can be legally before you cross the line, and you can be a felon once you cross that line. So there's been a large push for reciprocity, so that if you have a legal right and have a permit from your state, that should be recognized just as your driver's license is in other states. A few years ago, that passed the House and failed within a vote in the Senate. It wouldn't have become law because President Obama would have vetoed it, but it made the point. I would be surprised if reciprocity in some form does not pass within the next year or so, because of the nature of the Senate, the nature of the people that are up for election. The House will pass it. The President has said he would sign it. The two major goals of the NRA legislatively are reciprocity and hearing protection, or the legalization of suppressors, because of the effort to close down gun ranges by neighbors who think they're too noisy. And I think both of those things will pass.
Right here. And then we'll come over here.
Thank you. Gentlemen, actually, that was my question also, but I want to add to it. Why do you think that Speaker Ryan is not trying to bring it up?
The what?
Reciprocity. What do you think Speaker Ryan is not trying to bring it up? I mean, do you think he'll bring it up sometime soon?
Well, I don't know what the schedule will be, because our people do, but it'll be brought up when they think that they have the chance to get it done. They're expecting, and they have agreed that we're going to do it. The question is one of timing. I would expect, frankly, that the suppressor bill will pass before reciprocity because of the hostility to some in the Senate on that question. But it has to be brought up, and they know this, close to, but not after, the 2018 election. Because in the Senate, where you're going to need 60 votes, there are numerous people running for re-election that do not want to vote no on that bill. And think about this. I talked about how would you guess that there'd be concealed carry in all of these states by now? In 1980, there were only 3 states that allowed it. Today, there are 15.5 million people who have concealed carry permits. Now, you can be liberal, you can be conservative, but when 15.5 million people want something, it makes an impact. And that's why it's going to happen, and that's why members of the Senate, in particular, in states that just use 2 examples. Montana with John Tester, West Virginia with Joe Manchin, Democrats that will always follow the leadership on key votes, but they aren't going to follow the leadership on that one before an election. And there are others that are in that same position. So timing is everything. If I were doing it, and I haven't talked to Paul Ryan or his people, I wouldn't want to do it right now. I'd want to do it next summer as the election approaches, because that's when you're going to have maximum leverage against these people.
So speaking of 15.5 million people who want something, maybe we can want term limits?
Right over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I'm a little gloom for California, but what's really think that the game plan of California politicians? I mean, it just seems that you just really want to take our guns. With the ammo restrictions coming up, magazines, our California gun roster, and I just don't see anything changing. I really don't. I mean, do I move to Arizona? I mean,
that's one way to do it, or
yeah,
Vermont.
I just
you have
and I
armed
really
socialists
think
in Vermont.
Kamala Harris. I mean, everyone, Becerra. I mean, they just really just want to take our guns.
Well, there are a lot of people that I mean, the forward to our book when you buy it, was
that's why I asked them.
it was by John Bolton, and John in the foreword says that this reminds him of the unilateral disarmament movement of the 60s and 70s. You remember that? If we would just disarm, there would be world peace. We'd be fine. And it was sure there were people exploiting, the communists and others, but there were a lot of people who really believed that. And it's the reason that the argument over guns continues. The empirical evidence supports the pro-Second Amendment view, the historical evidence on the law, the empirical evidence on policy. But there are a lot of people in this country who, in a quasi-religious sense, believe that if they could snap their fingers and firearms would disappear, there'd be no problems. There'd be no more home break-ins. There'd be no more robberies. 7-Elevens would be safe. There wouldn't even be suicides. And the fact that that's not true is not as important as the fact that they believe that. Now, many of the things that you're talking about will not be solved unless, to my previous question, when the court changes, because many of the things that are being adopted in some states are things that will not stand strict scrutiny in the United States Supreme Court. Right now, in the various jurisdictions, for example, 2 jurisdictions have said that you can ban AR-15s. 2 others have said you can't, not under Heller, which actually almost specifically addresses it. That will have to be resolved by the Supreme Court. Many of the laws that you're talking about will have to be resolved by the Supreme Court. In the state of Maryland, right after the Sandy Hook thing, the governor actually, this one fell without going to court. The restrictive package that he imposed was bad enough, but he imposed taxes, regulations, and requirements that would have increased the cost of a handgun by $500 within the state. And finally, the state equivalent of the Congressional Black Caucus went to the Democratic governor, and they said, now we get it. We understand what you're trying to do. It's okay for wealthy people that can afford it to defend themselves. What you're saying is we can't. Isn't that it? And of course, to some degree, that is it. But he had to withdraw that. You know, I don't want to go on too long, but I'm often accused of that. You know, when you hear a Supreme Court case, I went to law school a long time ago. I deny it, but I'll admit it for the purposes of this question or this remark. You study an appellate case that's before the Supreme Court, and it's about some point of law. And you don't really understand what happened, what led to that case, because that's not what that they focus on. There's Calvin Coolidge was mentioned earlier. Amity Shlaes, who wrote a biography of Calvin Coolidge and wrote this book, Forgotten Man, about the Depression. She really got into that because she wrote about the Schechter case back during the Depression. The Schechter case struck down the National Recovery Act, a different NRA. And it's an important case that you learn about. Well, she went back and told the story of the case. It was about 3 Orthodox Jewish butchers in Brooklyn who actually let their customers pick the chicken they wanted to take home. And the federal government came in and said, no, you can't do that. When you read about Heller or McDonald, the 2 cases involving the Second Amendment, you just read about McDonald was a case that answered the question of whether this right would be incorporated so that it would apply in the states. That's what the case was about. But what was the case really about? It was about a man by the name of Otis McDonald. Otis McDonald was a black Chicago resident who his family had migrated from Louisiana or Mississippi back before the war. He didn't have a high school education. They moved to Chicago. He went off in the Army and fought in World War II. He came back. He got a GED. He bought a house in what was a pretty good neighborhood. He got married. He raised a family. He was a janitor in the Chicago schools and became actually the head of his local. And then as time passed, his family moved out, of course, moved on. His wife died. And his neighborhood was not what it was when he bought there. He couldn't sell the house. It was in a gangbangers neighborhood now. It was a drug area. People were being shot on the street. And Otis McDonald went to the city and said, I need to protect myself. And they said, you can't. And Otis went all the way to the Supreme Court. And famously, at the time, he said, you know, he read on his own, most of the gun laws in this country have their origin in Reconstruction. And he said, I was there, and I realized I was not representing just myself. I was representing generations of people like me. Gun laws in this country were first passed in a major way in the South because it was one thing to free the slaves, it was another thing to let them defend themselves. And it was because of the experience after that that Condoleezza Rice, for example, says on the question of the Second Amendment, I'm a fundamentalist because I remember when our neighbors had to surround our house with shotguns to protect the kids from the Klan. And we don't really, when we debate these things in an esoteric way, like I was talking about trade, we don't think about the people that are involved and what this really means to them. And the right to defend oneself is a key part of what America is about and always has been. And to take that away is something that's very serious and shouldn't be allowed, and I think won't be over time.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, well
One more?
put. Yeah, we've got time for one last question, so if we'll come right here. Yes, sir.
Thank you for speaking.
Got it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, right there.
Thank you for
I'm
speaking.
only allowed to answer with one word.
Say okay. I've been a gun dealer. I'm retired now. I own 7 stores here in Los Angeles. And I gave up the business because of the harassment.
Harassment.
Yeah. Well, this is not new to you. Okay. What amazed me is that I had no one to go to past LAPD who considers themselves to be federal agents because they became marshals. And in areas that I had stores that weren't even part of LAPD, like Burbank, they still went after us because they said, well, we're federal marshals now. And I had absolutely, it's a very helpless feeling not know who to go to. Mm-hmm. Now, I know it's not the responsibility of the NRA because they got their hands filled with what they do. But what is one to do in this scenario? Okay, number one. Number two, when the city of LA says you can only have 10 rounds now in a magazine, and a federal judge says you're making everybody a criminal. And now it's on hold for this. But why would a municipality have that kind of right over the federal law?
Well, because that hasn't been decided by the courts.
You keep getting back.
Yeah, that hasn't been decided by the courts, and until that's decided, if that restriction is viewed as a unnecessary and too heavy a restriction on the Second Amendment rights of the citizen, and it's been incorporated against the states and the local localities, then they won't have a right to do that. But that's something that the court has to decide, because there are courts now that have upheld these magazine restrictions, saying they're reasonable, and there are others who have said they're not reasonable at all. The New York law that was rammed through after Sandy Hook by Governor Cuomo restricted it to 7 rounds, but they had to change it because it made every cop in the state a criminal, because there was no such thing as a 7-round magazine. You know?
Wow. Well, let me just say, David, on behalf of everyone here, it's just been a terrific discussion, and we cannot thank you enough for coming all the way out here to visit with us. So thanks so much. And for all of you, as David said, he'll be here in the store for several minutes to sign
Tom
your
will be
books.
with me.
Tom will be with him, so if you please stop by and say hi to David, that'd be great. Thanks so much, David.
It was my pleasure.
Terrific.